Hey everyone, so in our last video we talked about the bind function, and we talked about it in kind of a little bit of detail. This time around I thought I'd talk about how to use prototypes in addition to the bind function to make it easier for those to use just simply .bind as opposed to writing out a function bind with a context and a name and then returning all this stuff. It would be really cool to just basically say something something dot bind and then it just basically returns back exactly what we want. So if it seems a little unclear from basically what I'm just saying, if you go over to like bind and you look up bind in Google, I guess MDN, that's the most famous website for looking up JavaScript methods. You'll go over to function.prototype.bind and let's see here. So you'll see that down here I have this little code snippet here. It says this.x is equal to 9, and then of course I have an object module, and then of course it has the value x 81, and then it has a function getX function return this.x. So when we call module.getX, it returns 81. And then of course when we say retrieveX is equal to module.getX and we call retrieveX, it returns 9 because x up here is the global scope. And if you remember in the last video too, if you just say this.x, then when you pass the function to another function, this is no longer your object, it's whatever this is. So you have to bind this to get the correct context. So in this case, we didn't bind, so because of that, this is now the window. So window.x returns 9. So in order for us to get the correct context, we have this convenience function here, bind, which before we had to kind of define up here in our original code snippet, but this time it's coming from prototype. And we'll talk about how that exactly works. But essentially, because it's in the prototype, this retrieveX here gets the bind method from the prototype, and it can take our module as an object, and then of course that will set the correct context for our retrieveX variable, and then of course when we call bound getX, it will return the right 81. So bound getX is essentially the retrieveX function bound to our module, and that returns bound getX, and bound getX returns 81. So let's go through this kind of more step by step. How exactly is that happening? So in order to understand this, I'm going to use again JavaScript Ninja book, and I'll go ahead and create a new index.html. So save, I'll go ahead and type in HTML. Actually, I have to save this first as in index.html. So I'll just say index2.html because I already have one. And then of course, because I've saved this as an HTML file, I can just type HTML like this, and then Sublime will take care of the rest. So bind example2. And of course, I'm just going to create another script tag here. And this time I don't have any HTML elements. Do note that. I don't need them for this time. Instead, I am going to go ahead and just start off by writing this function.prototype.bind method. And bear with me, I'm just going to write out some boilerplate code. We'll take a look at exactly what's going on. But essentially, the first thing I'm doing here is I'm just setting up what I call a closure. And if you're not familiar with closure, basically it is the ability for a function to remember some of its initialization code. So functions can exist in other functions in JavaScript, and so functions that live inside parent functions have access to all of the parents functions variables, and because of that, we can use closure to remember those variables even after the function has been executed. So I'll explain all that pretty soon. Just bear with me as I'm typing this all out. So this first part here, essentially what we're doing is I have a fn variable, which is going to be equal to this. We'll come back to what that is. Then I have arguments, which come from our function's arguments. We'll come back to that too. Then of course I'm going to, once I've get the arguments, I'm going to use the array prototype.slice.call method. And essentially this long thing here basically just calls the slice function, which exists on the array. So I'll just do that here. And I'm going to come back to that too, of course. But the thing to remember from the bind function is that it returns a function. So if anybody ever asks you, like, what does the bind function do? Remember, it always returns a function first and foremost. It doesn't return a function call. It returns a function that correctly sets the context for any future functions that you're trying to, call. So like in our last example, we were trying to call, a button.click method on a button object, but the context was set incorrectly, so we weren't calling the actual object. We were calling the button HTML button, and that wasn't setting the correct context. And in the same way, we weren't calling the correct X value. We were sort of calling the Windows X value as opposed to the other X value that we saw in MDN. So remember, bind sets the value correctly, the context value correctly. So okay, almost done here. Okay, so, and then of course we have to use this. So essentially, I'm going to use it with that code that we were looking at just now. So I'll just jump this in over here. So I'm kind of going off a little bit from that example from Secrets of the JavaScript Ninja, but that's okay. This will work just fine with this. So let's look again at what's going on here. So we have this.x is equal to 9. Then we have an object. And remember, this here is the window. So window.x is equal to 9. However, we have an x variable here. So this would be module.x is equal to 81. So when I use module getX, that returns 81. However, when I call module.getX and I save this in retrievex, retrievex now becomes 9 because the value of this is actually window.x, not the getX. It's not saving a correct reference, so we have to bind. So down here, I'm using retrievex, right? And retrievex is just a copy of this function here, which is a copy of this function here. So retrievex is basically returning this.x, but I'm going to bind my correct object here. So let's look up over here. So first thing I'm saying is saying fn is equal to this. So in my case over here, this is now equal to retrievex. So retrievex is this variable here, because functions are also objects in JavaScript. So retrievex now has a property of this. It has a property of bind from this prototype. So we're getting the original value of retrievex, storing it here, and then of course we're getting the arguments. So the arguments would be the module, and then of course the arguments, we're going to use array.prototype.slice.call. So jumping back over here, let's see what that does. So when I say slice down here in this example here, I'm saying that I want to get the first element and the third element, or first element through the third element. So you remember array start at 0, so we're going to skip over banana and we're going to start at orange. So that would be 1 and then 2. So this is going to return everything up to 3. So I'm going to get 1 and 2, so I'm going to return back orange and lemon. So essentially this thing does the same thing. This slice here, basically, first off, I'm getting arguments. And I think the best way to see what's going on here is to do some console logs. So we're going to do console log fn just to see what the function is. And then let me go ahead and separate this with commas. Colons, I mean. So we'll go ahead and console log arguments. And then of course args. And then of course we'll also make this var object. I wrote it originally kind of in that other style because you'll see a lot of programmers do that. They'll comma separate all of their variables in one line. So you'll probably see it like this, blah, and something else. So you can write it this way, or you can write it the other way, which we have down here. But this is kind of like a fast way to just build, your variables if you're doing it fast. But the only downside is you can't console log everything. You kind of have to break it out if you want to see what each thing is. So let's also console log object, because we'll probably take a look at that too. And always console log, because it's a very useful way to kind of know, okay, this is what's happening in my code, especially if you don't understand it. So I'm going to save, and then I'm going to come back to this, and I just need to make sure I put a 2 here, otherwise this isn't going to be the right path. And notice that the button is gone now, but that's okay. I've right-clicked and I've inspected, and then of course I'm coming over, and I have an undefined here, so let's see what that is. If I click this, it says console log fn. Okay, so fn hasn't been defined yet on that line, but it has been defined right here. So I just need to bring this down 1. So I'll just do this again, console log fn. Okay, refresh. So now if I come back, now you can see that fn is that original function here, retrieve x. And retrieve x just points to this get x. So in this case, fn is equal to that function. So if this is kind of confusing, remember that functions are also objects, and because we're using the bind method has access to the original function that called it, which is this. Bind exists on a function, so it's just another property on the function. So that's how we get fn. And then of course arguments. Arguments is kind of like an array in that it has a length, and of course it also has indexes right here, but it also has the original function and properties inside. So it's not really an array. This is an array here on line 15 here. So if you look at it, it just has one property length. But we can use the slice method to trick JavaScript into thinking, oh, this has a, this arguments here, which gets passed from here. We can trick JavaScript into thinking, oh, like this length here is 1, and this thing has an index, so it must be an array. So because we're doing that, basically it strips arguments out. So all this stuff here gets stripped out and then actually put inside your object as an array here. So essentially what we're doing is we're converting this object, the arguments object, into an array using the array prototype.slice method. And then of course you can see it right here. So just like in our other example here, we return a new array. So in the same way, we're returning a new array with just our object. So, and actually, if I go down one more, here it says args.shift, right? So after I console log args, I shift, and the shift method basically pulls these arguments out of my array and saves it as an object. So it's a little bit of kind of like tweaking, like our original thing here. So module, then of course you pull it out of the arguments list, then you convert it into an array, then of course you shift it from your array, and then you get the original object by itself. One of my students had a little bit of a difficult time with this because there was so much going on here. But essentially, anytime you pass arguments to, JavaScript function, even if it's not there, like by definition, like how we have here, JavaScript still has access to anything that gets passed in the function. So we don't have any parameters here, but because we passed in something anyway, we can get that value right here. And so, but the whole thing is a gigantic object, and that's not what we want. We just want this stuff here, x is equal to 81 and get x. We want that. So in order to get at this, we need to strip it out using the slice method, the array.prototype.slice, and then once we do, then we can shift from our actual array. We've converted this arguments object into an array, and then because it is now an array, we can shift the actual object we want and pull it out, and then once we pulled it out, we have access to it. So now we have access to our object, and we have access to our original function. So we have created what we call a closure here. So these variables are available to our new future function. So when we call this function here, which gets returned from bind, remember bind returns a function, and once we call the bind function, it will set the correct context for us. So in this case here, fn is still going to be our retrievex function, and we're going to use apply to call it, and we're going to set the value of the object to now be our object that was passed here. So in this case, this is how we set our context. So module will now be the value of this. And so when we call bound get x, which is going to be our new function, bound get x is going to return 81 instead of 9. And so because of that, here you can just think of the args.concat. So essentially this last part here is we're just taking our arguments, which is now an empty array, and if there are any arguments here in our new function called bound get x, we want to just slice them off and then concat them with our other array. So essentially we just pass these two together, and then of course we have the main thing you want to take away from this is we're just basically calling the original function with any new arguments. So that returns bound get x, which is setting the context properly. But I thought it might be kind of helpful to understand how exactly that happens, because you may not know like what is happening here in this prototype method, but now that you've kind of seen, like how it remembers, the original function and arguments, and we saw a little bit of, I call this like tooling. Now that you've seen like how this kind of works, you can kind of appreciate how the bind function in general is useful for setting the context. Anytime you have to like specify, an object to a function, and you want to avoid like, getting weird stuff like the window, the bind function is very useful for setting the context correctly. And you also get an appreciation for why you need to set context in any case. So I hope you liked this tutorial. Any questions, hit me up in the chat or the comments below, and I'll try to answer them. Thanks for watching.